Every fall has its own kind of atmosphere, but November always feels a little different. The air gets colder in a way that feels almost personal, like the season is creeping up on you, instead of simply changing. The trees lose their colors and stand there like thin, dark silhouettes against a gray sky. Even the wind feels heavier, like it's carrying whispers you can't quite understand. People say November is quiet, but it's not a peaceful kind of quiet. It's the kind that makes you feel watched, even when you're alone. And for Lily, a college freshman who had just moved into an old dorm building, that November silence became something she wished she could forget. Her dorm was built in the 1930s, and you could feel the age of the place in every step you took. The floors creaked, the walls were uneven, and the hallways always smelled slightly damp, like old wood that would never fully dry. Lily tried to convince herself it was charming in an old-fashioned way. But once November arrived, it didn't feel charming anymore. It felt unsettling, like the building was trying to warn her about something. On her very first night of November, Lily lay in bed scrolling through her phone when she heard a soft knocking. She thought it was someone at her door, so she called out gently, asking who it was. But the knocking didn't come from the door. It came from inside her closet, not on the closet door inside the closet. A slow, hollow knock every few minutes, almost like someone tapping from behind the wall. At first she tried to ignore it. Old dorms made weird noises, right? Maybe it was pipes, or the wind rattling something. But the knocking happened again, and again, each time a little louder, a little more impatient. She stared at the closet door for a long time, her heart beating faster as the seconds passed. She finally forced herself to get up, telling herself she was being dramatic. She opened the closet door slowly, expecting to see a loose hanger hitting the wall, or maybe a box shifting. But what she found was much worse. There were scratches on the back wall of the closet, long, deep scratches, carved in thick lines across the wood. Not like something accidentally scraped. These marks were deliberate, repeated, like something had dragged its nails or claws over and over behind the wall. Lily stood there staring, feeling her stomach twist. She touched the surface lightly and felt how uneven and torn the wood was. She quickly shut the closet, pulled her chair in front of it, and turned on every light in the room. She didn't sleep at all. The next night, the same knocking came again, slow at first, then stronger, as if whatever was behind the wall knew she was listening. Each time she tried to ignore it, her anxiety grew. She started noticing other things too. The room felt colder than the hallway. The lights flickered more often, and sometimes she swore she heard faint breathing when she stood near the closet. After a week of barely sleeping, she asked the dorm administration if she could switch rooms. They moved her to a different floor, and the moment she settled in, the knocking stopped. The air felt lighter. She finally slept through the night for the first time in days. But a few days later, she bumped into the new girl who took her old room, and with a nervous laugh, the girl mentioned she didn't sleep much her first night because she heard knocking inside her closet. Lily didn't say anything. She didn't want to know more. She just walked away, trying to convince herself the building was simply old. But deep down, she knew it wasn't age. Something was inside those walls. Another story from that same cold November night came from a man named Howard, a delivery driver who worked late shifts and preferred the quiet of nighttime roads. He had delivered to every type of house, big, small, fancy, run down, and nothing usually bothered him. But this night was different. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet, and the streetlights flickered in a way that made the shadows move just a little too slow. He approached the house where he needed to drop off a package. The porch light was off, but the window facing the front yard had its curtains open just enough for him to see inside. Standing in the living room was a tall, thin woman. She didn't move. She didn't wave. She just stood there facing the interior of the house. Howard knocked gently on the door, calling out that he had a package. No response. He knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Feeling uncomfortable, he turned to walk back to his truck. But before he got far, something made him look back. The woman in the window was now facing him. Her face was pale, unnaturally stretched, and she was smiling a long, horrific smile that didn't look human. Howard froze for a second, feeling like ice filled his chest. Then he dropped the package and ran back to his truck, not caring about delivery protocols or anything else. The next day, he told his company what happened. They checked the address and told him something that made him go cold all over again. That house had been empty for 3 years. No electricity, no furniture, completely abandoned. But Howard knew what he saw. The third false story came from a group of teenagers who liked exploring the woods behind their neighborhood. The forest was normal in the summer, bright, lively, full of kids playing. But in November, it became different. The trees lost their leaves, and the shadows between them looked darker. The air felt heavier, and even the ground seemed to absorb sound. One evening, just before sunset, the group wandered deeper than usual. That's when they found a wooden swing hanging from a tree. It wasn't old, and it didn't look like something built by kids. It was made from thick rope, tied tight, with a wooden plank smoothed and polished, like someone had taken time making it. The kids stood around it, confused, because they had never seen it before, and no one else used that part of the woods. One of the boys laughed and gave the swing a gentle push. It moved forward slightly, then came back. Nothing strange, until it kept going, higher and higher, even though there was no wind at all. The group fell silent as they watched the swing rise at an unnatural angle, almost like invisible hands were pushing it. Then they heard it a laugh, high-pitched, shaky, and way too close. It sounded like it came from right behind them. They didn't turn around, they just ran. And when they went back the next morning, the swing was gone. No rope, no plank, no marks on the tree, like it had never existed at all. The fourth story was from Tomas, a security guard who worked the midnight shift at an old museum downtown. He hated the night shift, mostly because the building made strange sounds that echoed through the hallways. He always felt like the exhibits were watching him, especially the mannequin section. One night, while checking the exhibits, he passed by the mannequin display like usual. They stood behind glass, perfectly still. He checked the locks and kept walking. A few minutes later, he heard footsteps behind him, slow, dragging footsteps. He turned around with his flashlight, raised and froze. One of the mannequins was standing in the middle of the hallway. He stared at it, trying to convince himself he was imagining things. The lights flickered once. When they came back on, the mannequin was closer, just a few feet away. Tomas didn't stick around to find out what would happen next. He ran to the control room, locked the door, and stayed there until the morning workers arrived. When they checked the exhibit, every mannequin was back in its case, perfectly posed. Tomas quit that week. The last story from that November came from an older woman named Grace, who lived alone in a small house on the edge of town. She liked the quiet, especially during fall, and often spent evenings by her window watching the leaves drift across her yard. One night, she noticed a tall man standing across the street. He wore a long coat, and he didn't move. She assumed he was waiting for someone, but after 30 minutes, he was still there. She turned off her lights, hoping he'd go away. But when she checked again, he was closer, standing right at the edge of her yard. She closed her curtains and tried calling the police, but her phone suddenly had no signal. Then a loud, slow knock hit her front door. Another knock followed. When she finally got the courage to open it, no one was there, but she saw footprints leading away from her house, footprints that didn't go back to the street. They led straight into the woods across from her home. She never looked out her window at night again. The second chapter of these fall horror stories is where the cold begins to settle deeper, not just in the air, but in the walls of people's homes. in the corners of rooms, and in the places where you normally feel the safest. What makes these stories even worse is that every person involved thought they were secure inside their own house. They had doors locked, lights on, heaters running, and reasons to believe nothing bad could reach them. But November has a way of slipping into the cracks, bringing things with it that don't care about locks or walls. And for a young man named Patrick, that truth hit him much sooner than he expected. Patrick had just moved into a small rental house in early November. He didn't have a lot of money, so the place wasn't fancy or modern, but it had this warm, peaceful feeling during the daytime. The house was surrounded by tall trees painted in red, orange, and brown, and when the sun hit the leaves, the whole area glowed like a painting. Patrick liked the quiet. He liked being away from the noise. He felt like he finally had a place to breathe. His first night was peaceful. He unpacked a bit, made himself some instant noodles, watched a movie, then went to bed earlier than usual. He slept well, but the second night was when things shifted from peaceful to terrifying. He was asleep when he woke up to a faint sound. At first, he wasn't sure if it was part of a dream or if it came from outside, but then it repeated slow, deliberate crunching. The unmistakable sound of footsteps on dry leaves, moving carefully outside his bedroom window. Patrick lay still, listening. He tried to convince himself it was deer or maybe raccoons. Animals wandered through the area all the time, but the longer he listened, the more he realized something was off. The steps weren't random like animals. They were slow, human slow. He sat up in bed, heart beginning to race. He listened harder, holding his breath. The footsteps stopped. Then he heard it whispering, soft, faint, almost blending with the wind, but not enough to be mistaken. Someone was whispering right beneath his window. It wasn't the murmur of two people talking. It was one voice, a woman's voice, low, shaky, and too close. Patrick froze. He didn't know what to do. He slowly moved the blanket aside, feeling each breath getting heavier. He decided to peek through the blinds, just enough to see without being seen. He lifted a single slat with his fingertip and almost stopped breathing. A woman was crouching under his window. She was so close he could see the top of her head and the pale skin of her hands pressed against the wall. Her fingers were spread wide, pressing into the cracks of the old wooden siding, and she was whispering. Not words he could understand, but something fast and desperate, like she was talking to the house itself. Or maybe to him. Patrick dropped the blind instantly. His heart hammered so loudly, he could barely hear anything else. He didn't dare move. He didn't even grab his phone because he was terrified the glow of the screen would leak through the blinds. He sat there in silence, trying not to panic, trying to convince himself it wasn't real. But then the whispering stopped, and that silence was worse than any sound. For a long time, he didn't hear anything, not footsteps, not breathing, not leaves. When he finally gathered the courage to peek again, she was gone. The next morning, he waited until the sun was fully up before going outside. He walked slowly toward the window, afraid of what he might find. And there they were, muddy handprints smeared along the side of the house. Some were high, some were low. Some looked like they were dragging down the wall. That was enough for him. He moved out before the week ended, and no matter who asked, he never described the whispering in detail again. The next story happened to a woman named Melissa, a schoolteacher who lived alone, except for her golden retriever, Samson. Samson was a big, friendly dog who rarely barked at anything. He was the type to greet strangers with a wagging tail rather than a growl. He wasn't protective. He wasn't aggressive. He was just gentle. So when Samson reacted to something, Melissa knew it had to be serious. One night, in the middle of November, the temperature had dropped sharply. The house felt colder, despite the heater running. Melissa had just finished washing dishes and was preparing to go to bed when she heard Samson growling. She didn't think much of it until she realized where he was standing right in front of the basement door. His fur was raised. His tail was stiff, and his growl wasn't the playful kind he made when he wanted attention. It was deep, low, and trembling. He kept staring at the door like something was on the other side, something he didn't want coming out. Melissa tried to calm him down, gently touching his back, telling him it was just the pipes again. The house was old, and the basement always made strange noises when the temperature dropped. But Samson didn't stop. He wouldn't even look away from the door. Then the doorknob rattled, not softly, violently, like someone was gripping it tightly from the other side and trying to twist it open. Melissa froze where she stood. Her hand dropped away from Samson, and she stared at the doorknob as it shook back and forth, metal clinking against metal. Samson barked, loud and sharp, the kind of bark she had never heard from him before. Melissa's mind raced. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands and called her brother. She didn't say much, just told him to come over right away. When he arrived, they stood together at the basement door. Melissa held her breath as her brother opened it quickly, ready for anything. The basement was empty, completely empty. But when they stepped inside and turned on the light, they saw something that made Melissa step back in fear. On the dusty floor, leading toward the far corner of the basement, were long scratch marks, deep ones, as if something or someone had been dragged down the steps recently. There were marks on the steps too, faint but visible under the dust. Her brother tried to brush it off as some kind of animal, but Melissa didn't believe that. She knew how old the basement was. She knew no animal big enough to make those marks could slip inside without breaking something. And most of all, she knew Samson had never reacted like that in his entire life. After that night, she refused to open the basement door after sunset. She even placed a heavy chair in front of it every night, and Samson never went near that door again. The third story from that cold November came from a kid named Joel, who lived with his family in an old farmhouse surrounded by empty fields. The place looked peaceful from the outside, the kind of home people imagined for a quiet, simple life. But Joel knew the house had its secrets. Every cold night, he heard footsteps in the attic. His parents insisted it was squirrels or raccoons moving around. But Joel didn't believe that, not after hearing how heavy the steps were, how slow and human they sounded. He could hear them pacing, stopping, then pacing again, like whatever was up there knew he was listening. But he kept quiet, until the night the footsteps came down the attic stairs. He heard each step creak, slow and careful, descending toward the hallway. Joel sat upright in his bed, his body frozen. He listened as the steps reached the top of the staircase and then moved across the hallway. Then they stopped right outside his bedroom door. He held his breath. A soft knock echoed through the room. A slow, patient knock, not the kind you hear when someone wants your attention. It sounded like someone tapping just to let him know they were there. Joel pulled the blanket over his head. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. And then he heard breathing, loud enough to hear through the wooden door, slow and steady, like something tall was standing just inches from the doorknob. He stayed like that for what felt like hours. When the morning sunlight finally came through his window, he waited even longer before opening the door. The hallway was empty. His parents said they found nothing, but the knocks continued every night until winter arrived. Joel still refuses to talk about what he saw the night he finally opened the door, but his mother said he screamed so loud the neighbors heard him from outside. The last chapter of these fall horror stories comes from the darkest November nights, the kind where even the wind seems too scared to move, and the cold air feels thick, like it's holding something and it's something watching, listening, waiting. By this point in November, the leaves are almost gone. The sky turns gray early in the afternoon, and the world feels just a little emptier. But it's in these empty spaces that the strangest things appear, and the people in these stories never expected what November would bring them. One of them was a nurse named Alina. She worked late shifts at a small clinic on the edge of town. The building wasn't big, only a few rooms and a tiny reception area. But it always felt colder at night, even when the heat was on. Alina didn't mind the late hours. She liked helping people, and she liked that the nights were usually quiet. But one particular night in November, she found out that quiet doesn't always mean safe. Her shift ended around 11 p.m. The hallway lights were dim, and the whole place felt heavier than usual, like the darkness outside was trying to push its way inside. Alina finished locking up the clinic doors, double-checking them because the cold made her hands shake. She grabbed her bag, pulled her coat tighter around her, and walked toward the parking lot behind the building. That's when she heard Ito baby crying that first. She stopped walking because she wasn't sure she heard it correctly. The sound was soft, almost too soft, carried gently through the cold air, but it was definitely crying. A baby. And it sounded like it was coming from the tree line behind the clinic. Alina froze. She knew no one lived back there. The area was mostly woods, and the nearest houses were far away. For a moment, she stood completely still, listening. The crying came again, higher this time, more desperate. Without thinking twice, her instincts took over. She ran toward the sound, her breath turning into clouds of fog in front of her face. She kept calling out, asking if someone was there, asking if someone needed help. But no one answered. She followed the sound all the way to the edge of the trees. Her heart was pounding, and her breath felt tight in her chest. But the closer she got, the more wrong the crying sounded. It didn't echo the way real crying should. It didn't bounce through the air naturally. It sounded hollow, like someone trying to imitate a cry, trying too hard, too perfect in some parts, too broken in others. Alina slowed down, suddenly unsure. She stood just a few steps from the tree line, staring into the darkness. The trees looked like tall, black silhouettes leaning over each other, and the cold air felt so still, it almost hurt. She listened again, waiting for the crying, but it stopped, completely. The silence was instant and sharp. Alina felt her whole body stiffen. The air around her suddenly felt different, heavier, thicker, like something was standing right in front of her, just inside the tree line, watching her. And then, from somewhere deep in the darkness, she heard a whisper. It said her name, not screamed. Not growled, whispered, soft and slow, like someone leaning inches from her ear. Her legs almost gave out. She turned around so fast she stumbled over her own feet. She ran toward her car, her hands trembling so badly she dropped her keys twice before she finally shoved them into the lock. She didn't even look back to see if someone or something was behind her. She just got in, slammed the door, locked it, and drove away with tears in her eyes. She quit her job 2 months later. She never told anyone exactly what she heard, but whenever someone brings up the woods behind the clinic, she goes pale and refuses to talk. Another terrifying fall story came from a man named Adrian. He lived in a town surrounded by forests and long empty roads, the kind where you could drive for miles and never see another car. One night, around 1 a.m., Adrian was driving home from visiting a friend. The fog was unbelievably thick that night, rolling across the road in heavy waves. The world looked like it had been swallowed by white smoke. His headlights barely cut through it, and the only sound was the soft rumbling of his engine. He drove slowly, fingers tightening around the steering wheel every time he felt the car drift slightly. The road was covered in fallen leaves, wet and slippery from earlier rain. Everything felt tense and oddly quiet. Then he saw her, a woman standing in the middle of the road. Adrian slammed on the brakes, his car skidding slightly before coming to a stop just a few feet away from her. His heart jumped into his throat. The woman stood perfectly still, wearing a long white dress that looked old and stained at the bottom. Her hair was long and black, covering her face completely. Adrian rolled his window down an inch, thinking maybe she needed help. Before he could say anything, She started moving toward him. Not walking normally. She moved slowly, dragging her feet like she was hurt or like she wasn't used to walking at all. The sound of something scraping against the pavement sent chills through him. He immediately locked his doors. The woman reached the side of the car and placed her hand on the window. Her fingers were wrong, too long, too thin, bending at angles that didn't look human. They looked almost spider-like, tapping gently on the glass. Adrian felt sick. His whole body screamed at him to leave. He hit the gas, tires spinning on the wet leaves, and the car shot forward. The fog swallowed everything around him, and he didn't stop until he reached his driveway. His hands were shaking so badly he had to sit in the car for a few minutes, just to collect himself. When he finally got out and walked around his car, he noticed scratch marks along the side. Long, deep scratches. Too long to be from any person. He didn't sleep that night, and he avoided that road for months. The final story from that freezing November came from an elderly man named Ron. He had lived in his neighborhood for over 30 years and knew every street, every corner, every tree. Every November, he took long evening walks through the nearby park to clear his head and enjoy the crisp air. He loved watching the last of the fall leaves drift down from the branches, the streetlights glowing softly through the dark orange colors. But one night, as he walked down the familiar path, something felt different. The wind wasn't moving. The leaves weren't rustling. Even the sky looked wrong, too dark, too empty. As Ron turned the corner near the playground area, he noticed someone standing under one of the streetlights. At first, he thought it was just a child waiting for their parents. It looked like a little girl in a red coat. She stood perfectly still, facing away from him. Ron approached slowly, calling out to her gently, but she didn't move. He walked a little closer, the gravel crunching under his shoes. As he got within a few feet, he noticed something that made him stop immediately. Her feet weren't touching the ground. She was hovering just a few inches above the pavement, her body swaying slightly left and right like someone pushing her on an invisible swing. Ron stared, frozen. His breath caught in his throat. Then, without turning her body, the girl's head rotated toward him, slowly, too slowly. And when her face came into view, Ron felt his knees weaken. Her eyes were pitch black. No whites, no pupils. Just empty darkness staring straight at him. She didn't speak. She didn't move closer. She just stared. Ron turned and ran, something he hadn't done in years. He didn't look back. When he reached his house, he locked the doors, turned off all the lights, and sat in his kitchen shaking. From that night on, he refused to walk outside after sunset ever again. These 5 true fall horror stories remind us that November might look peaceful, with its soft colors and quiet nights, but sometimes the cold hides things we're not meant to see, things that only come out when the leaves fall and the world grows silent.